Hey everyone, it's Wingspan TT, the fourth best commentator on the planet, and today I want to put together a little bit of a guide for my Holy Fire Archer in Diablo 2. Now what is this build? It's not quite a serious build, but actually what I've found out from building it out is it's not nearly as bad as I would have thought. As it sounds, the build is based around having a bow and arrow or a crossbow with your paladin and using the aura Holy Fire, which if people are not aware is not frequently known as being a very good skill, alright? It's a level 6 ability where you look at even level 32, the skill that I have here is 1600 damage to an attack, and that is completely eclipsed by things like Corpse Explosion, Fireball, the other kind of fire attacks that you see in the game. How good can this be, especially when you're using a bow on a paladin? You don't even have combat skills to use that apply, and you can't apply that damage in a way like Zeal or even Vengeance can. But what I found from building this out and getting the equipment and thinking about it and planning it is that this is totally viable. I have defeated Baal on Hell solo with this build. I regularly clear cows with this build. I can pretty much clear all content and feel good about it, never really even dying. And yes, I have good gear now, but as you'll see, the core of the build is cheap, it's fun, it's effective, it's safe, and it's different. So let's get to it. So what is this build? Holy Fire. It basically, as the skill tells you, creates an aura that adds two types of fire damage. One is added to your weapon attacks, which is the larger damage, and the secondary radius damage all around you every 1 or 2 seconds, a pulse of damage. Now that second part is not important to this build, but what is important is the fire damage, adding in this case 1000, 2000 fire damage to your attacks. Now that doesn't sound so great. When you look at other skills, they have higher damage. Even Holy Freeze and Holy Shock have much higher damage. And if you've seen Dream Paladins, they can get insane values past that. But there is something special that needs to be known which makes this build possible. It's not just about slapping fire damage on any bow, it's about slapping fire damage on a bow with explosive arrows or bolts. And in this case, the Kuko Shikaku Cedar Bow. So what is special about this bow? It has fire damage on it, it has piercing attack, which is great, and we'll talk about that later. But more importantly, it fires explosive arrows or bolts, as it says in the description. Now there are multiple bows and crossbows that have this property. It does not have to be this bow, but this is pretty much the cheapest and easiest one to get, and it's just fun, and I like the purple look. When you fire explosive arrows or bolts, what that means is that your default attack, your default weapon attack, is no longer just shooting normal arrows. It fires from your default attack the same kinds of arrows that an Amazon uses when she uses the skill Explosive Arrows. That means that for no mana whatsoever and for no additional skill investment, all of your default attacks are an explosive arrow that explodes, it hits monsters, it hits everything in a small radius around it. That's great, but if you look at the stats in Explosive Arrow, they're not very high. You're talking 80, 100, 200, 300 damage. You might be asking yourself, that's not going to clear anything. But doing 300 damage in a radius is not going to do anything, especially with no synergies on a paladin. But there's actually a small and kind of unintuitive aspect to explosive arrows and bolts that many new players won't know about. And that is that all of the fire damage from all of your character's skill and equipment are all added to that explosion radius. That means that skills like Holy Fire will add all of their damage, all of this damage, 1,600, 1,700 damage, gets added to the explosion radius. And not only that, but other sources of fire as well. So if you have small charms, large charms in your inventory that add fire damage, this 7 damage, 8 damage, 10 damage here, all of that gets added to explosion radius as well. And things like Lava Gout adding fire damage, also having a chance to cast enchant when you're attacking, that enchant fire damage also gets added to your attack. So there you go, that's just a start. And as you can imagine, you can start to see how this comes together, right? If you're adding 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 fire damage on all your gear and equipment, now you're shooting these 3,000 damage arrows non-stop that cost 0 mana that deal explosive radius damage. But there's more to it than that. And the thing that you have to consider is that when you fire, when you use Holy Fire, yes, it adds damage to your attacks, and yes, this damage is going to the explosion radius. It's actually going to both. So the damage that's added to your attacks, this damage that you're seeing on the screen here, 1,630, that gets added to the arrow itself that hits the monster. But then explosive arrows or bolts that's added by your item basically adds it again. You get duplicate damage. So when you're seeing fire explosive arrows or bolts, you're seeing this damage. The fire portion of this, the damage that's coming from holy fire in your gear, this 2,000 or so damage, that is being applied twice to every single monster you hit. Once with the arrow, then once in the radius. And what's even better than that is when you use a weapon like a Kuko bow and it has piercing arrows, if you hit the first target and then it pierces and it hits another monster behind it and there's another explosion from there, that's triggering the explosive radius damage again. So if you're hitting 2 or 3 monsters in a row that are tightly packed together, the first monster gets hit by the arrow for 2,000 damage. Then it gets hit by the explosion for 2,000 damage. Then the monster behind it gets hit and explodes for another 2,000 damage, and the one behind that. So instead of just doing 2,000 damage now per arrow, that first monster may have taken 6, 8,000 damage, possibly more, depending on how tightly everything is packed, which means that large swarms of monsters, bugs, even cows, take insane damage very, very quickly. And that's what this build is all about. That's what's built around. The piercing, explosion, the fire, chaos damage, and that's the fun part. Now, one thing to be aware of is that yes, you actually have to land your arrows to get that first damage. You'll see my attack rating here is very low, 865, which is why I have a mercenary with a blessed aim aura. We'll talk more about that later. It's also why I'm using lava gouts to give myself a little bit more attack rating through enchant. That can easily double your attack rating with the right, gearing and stuff like that. But what's really interesting is that the explosion from firing explosive arrows or bolts does not require attack rating. You do not have to hit your target for that explosion to deal damage. It does not have to hit your target. So you really can actually subsist quite well. You won't be getting double damage, but you'll still be getting at least single damage plus the piercing explosions out of it with low attack rating. But again, there's ways to solve the attack rating problem. But they're not actually that important, especially for normal and nightmare. Once you get to hell, you do want to, of course, hit your targets. So let me just talk real quick about what does this build require. We've said before, you need a bow that does explosive arrows or bolts. The Kuko Shikaku is cheap. It's fun. It's got very low requirements of strength and dexterity. You do not want to upgrade this thing to an elite item. There's no reason to do that. You don't need physical damage, okay? I have socketed here with a shale to hit the 75% increased attack speed breakpoint that you need to get this to a 10-frame attack. You can get to a 9-frame attack with 125%. It's really not necessary. You're going to really gimp your build, and it's going to cost you a lot more to build that, but it is possible. So you have that. I have a razor tail belt, which adds piercing attack, adds an additional 33% chance to pierce on top of the 50% from the Kuko bow. That's 83%, which is very, very respectable and definitely more than enough. And that's it as far as what's required for the build. I highly recommend lava gouts because yes, they add fire damage to radius. They add 20% increased attack speed that makes it easier to hit your breakpoints. And more importantly, it adds enchant on striking, which again is going to add even more fire damage to the arrow and to your explosion radius. But it's also going to greatly improve your attack rating. As you can see in some of the footage, I have my attack rating with my mercenary and with enchant can get much higher than the base of 865. I'll be hitting attack ratings much closer in the 3,000-4,000 range, even 7,000 with different gearing. For the armor, I highly recommend a treachery. It doesn't have to be a wire fleece. I just love the way it looks because he's got that kind of like, he's got two separate, forearm armors here. Feels more like an archer, like a ranger. But treachery, even though it is an assassin armor, by now people who play Diablo know that this is a great armor for many classes. It adds 45% increased attack speed, which is huge to hitting a 75% breakpoint. You have 20% faster hit recovery, also super helpful. Yes, you get extra gold, cold resist. None of that stuff matters. The other two things that matter are the chance it has venom on striking, adding a little bit of poison damage. It's really not that much, but it's just enough to just stop monster healing for tiny ticks at a time. And the chance to cast fade when struck. You'll see I'm in hell right now. My resists are okay in the 30s to 40s. And yes, I have very good gear, but maybe you would be in the around 10% range, without the best gear. What fade allows is when you do get hit, and you shouldn't be getting the hit that much because you are an archer, you should be in the back lines. You have a chance to cast fade, which will give you about 60% resist all, which is going to hit you either to max or very close to max or even above maximum, as you'll see, because the paladin in the Holy Fire build gets to max out these skills that allow it to get higher total resistances in things like fire resist. I picked up a rare tiara from someone. It had faster run walk, it had +2 to paladin skills, it had 19 resist all. This was great. It was actually really cheap. I socketed it. I threw a very cheap fire facet in here that people are just giving away non-perfect perfect facets left and right, which of course is going to add more fire damage, increase fire skill damage, and lower enemy fire resist. And the rest of this stuff doesn't really matter. You can get a Raven Frost, you can get resist rings. It doesn't really matter what your rings are, whatever you're comfortable with. And of course the charms, as many offensive aura charms as you can. But if you can't even afford those, pick up some little fire damage charms. Some of them are not expensive at all, and every little amount counts, right? If you add 20 fire damage to your attack, like we said before, it's going to be doubled, tripled, possibly even octupled from what you're actually hitting. So adding 20 fire damage in a charm, 10 fire damage could actually be adding 50, 100, 200 fire damage depending on what you're doing. That is a big difference. Let's talk about the skills. And the skills are actually really simple, which makes this build very flexible for how you want to play. First of all, you need to maximize out Holy Fire. This is the thing that's dealing most of your damage. And of course, you want to look at the synergies for it. You have Resist Fire, which has 18% damage a level. You will be maximizing that out. The other thing that Resist Fire does, in addition to being an option to have higher fire resist if you really need it to survive, let's say Hydras at the Traffic Call or something like that, is it also passively increases your fire resistance. Having 85% fire resist is huge and something to consider with your build. The other synergy for Holy Fire is Salvation. Now it is a much lower synergy, and when you have high skill levels, you're going to see that you're really only getting a 1% increase per level that you put in Salvation. I still recommend that you put at least 5 or 10 points in it, but don't really feel like it's necessary. You're going to be doing plenty of damage with just Holy Fire and Resist Fire maxed out. Obviously, one of the first things everyone will ask with this build is, how do you handle fire immunes? And I handle them just fine. What I do is I've maxed out Holy Freeze and also Resist Cold, and of course the points in Salvation create a lot of damage. Now you'll see that Holy Freeze has much higher damage than Holy Fire, right? You'll see Holy Freeze is adding 2200 damage attack, much higher, but keep in mind that that damage is not being added to the explosion radius of my arrows. It's only being added to the arrow itself. So it is a little slower. It's lower DPS. You're not clearing mobs as fast, but you still have piercing attacks if you're using a Kuko bow or a demon machine, a razor tail, anything like that. It is not really as slow as it feels. You'll be doing lots of damage, and even more importantly, you'll be slowing enemies by somewhere between 50 and 60%, depending on what skill level you get to. That is huge for safety. It means that you are not going to be in grave danger of anything, but you can basically save your mercenary anytime with a mixture of potions and Holy Freeze by just bringing all the enemies to a crawl. So 60, 80 points, what do you do with the rest? You can dump them in Salvation, which I have not maxed yet. I like to put 1 point in each of these defensive auras because they have so much utility, and by spending just 5 points, you get so much utility. You get Cleansing to get rid of your curses and poison much faster. You have Vigor with just 1 point in and getting some plus to skills. This can go a big way, adding 10, 20, 30% run walk speed, especially early in the game where you don't have a lot of stamina. But just in general, it's nice to be able to move fast. And you'll see in my gameplay, just in between shots or repositioning, I use Vigor, switch off, switch back on. It's super helpful. But Redemption is also great because you can clear corpses from enemies that make it annoying, resurrecting the little minions. But you can also use it to just gain a huge health and mana boost. But here's the thing, you don't need mana for this build as we talked. You do not have any combat skills in this build. You won't be spending mana. Your auras and your exploding arrows are all you use, which means all you need is health. And as we said before, you do not need a lot of dexterity because you're not doing physical arrow damage. And if you choose the Blessed Aim Merc, that's what's going to give you most of the attack rating. So as a result, what you'll see is that I have a few points in dexterity. You'll see my base is 42, very low. A few points in strength, okay? And all of the rest in the vitality, your base vitality being enormous. You're going to easily have 1,300, 1,400, 1,500 or 1,600 life, depending on your gearing. That is huge. It's very good for staying alive. And once you're hitting max resist, whether it's through something like Treachery or other gear, or you choose to have lots of resist charms or anything like that, you'll be alive just fine. You can have a call to arms and a weapon switch if you want to have even more life, easily hit 2,000, 2,500 life. But it's not that important. What's important is playing smart and safe and having fun. And you'll see that overall, to have fun with this build, you do not need any high runes. You don't need anything expensive. I've thrown a couple extra items here, but it really comes down to maxing out Holy Fire and its synergies, getting a Kuko bow or demon machine, and going nuts. Now, I do want to point out there are some alternatives if you do not want to go the Holy Freeze route. One of the things you could do is you could go into Holy Shock. Holy Shock at level 20, 30, whatever level you can get it to, is going to have much higher damage than Holy Fire or Holy Freeze. Remember, that damage does not go in explosion radius because it's not fire damage, but it is a good option for dealing with fire immunes and for just, again, having fun and shooting little lightning out of your arrows. The other option would be to maximize something like Fanaticism. Just spend the extra 3 points down this tree, go to Fanaticism, max this out for physical damage and attack speed and attack rating. The one thing though is that the Kuko bow, Demon Machine, these explosive arrow bows don't have a very high physical damage. So you would want to have on weapon switch some kind of bow that actually does high physical damage. I would recommend Witch Wild String because it's cheap. It's easy to get. You can get it up to very fast speeds. It has high resist and also shoots magical arrows, which means you do not have to stock arrows. You can basically shoot arrows forever for free. You'll get a small attack rating bonus, and you also do a small amount of magical damage. There is one more option, which is kind of like option 3B or something like that at this point, which would be to maximize Conviction. With Conviction maxed out, you reduce the resist of enemies, which means you can take away their fire immunity or any other immunity, right? This is why Infinity is such a big deal for so many people who are rich. But the thing with Conviction is it is currently bugged. As of the time of making this video, it is currently bugged in Diablo 2 Resurrected. It cannot be used with ranged weapons. So, but right now I can't recommend it because it doesn't work in the game. Maybe, hopefully in the future, they fix that bug. Until then, I can't really test it well enough to let you know if it would work. Some of the best places to run, in my experience, are places where there's a lot of very tightly packed enemies and not a huge number of fire immunes. For instance, the maggot layer in particular. This is a place people hate running because it's so compact, it's so tight, there's nowhere to go. But that works to your favor because you have a piercing, explosive attack that does more damage the more enemies are lined up in a row, which means you blow through the bugs. You're like a complete exterminator running through the maggot layer. The only place I struggled truly the most was with Hell Ancients. As you know, when you're fighting the Ancients, they can spawn fire immune, cold immune. You've got these 3 extremely deadly warriors facing you at the same time. They can pretty much kill you very quickly, and on top of that, they are hard to apply damage to. I think it might be easier to face them with Fanaticism, possibly, but it is a difficult fight. So that's pretty much it. The Holy Fire Archer, if you want to call it a Bowadin or a Ranger or whatever, is super fun. It's super cheap. You only need a couple easy uniques to get, and even those things are flexible. And the skill point progression feels good too, because as you're leveling, your main skill is a level 6 skill. You will have it from starting the game, which means you get to mow down content as you progress. And if you get tired of the grind at any point, just go back to normal, hunt chip gems all day, throw on your Holy Fire pulse damage, grab some popcorn, and enjoy. Well everyone, I'm Wingspan TT, the 4th best commentator on the planet. This has been my Diablo 2 Resurrected Holy Fire Archer build. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you have a chance to try it out yourself. If you have any questions about this build whatsoever, please leave them in the comments. I'd be glad to answer them. And until next time, cheers.